I want to start, Glenn, by asking you about when you first sort of started to know you wanted to work in this way with people. Was it therapeutically, or did it sort of start more around a value of social justice, or how did it sort of come about?
Yeah, that's a good question. You hit the nail on the head, Alex, straight away, I think. Um, I was originally a teacher in Queensland many years ago, and that started my thinking around, as you just said then, social justice and uh, people's own self-determination and etc. And I was part of originally the humanistic education movement or model, if you like, that was present in the 70s and was a fairly strong movement in education and influenced like concepts like open education, etc., and was very much involved in group work and group facilitation. It was also the era of the development of concepts like sensitivity groups and group learning and group dynamics, etc. And that's really what got me thinking: the power of people working together in a collaborative way and learning together and sharing learnings. And that opened me for the development of that in other professional areas. I could go on there, but how much do you want? Like
Was
the
that,
next movement? Yeah, go on.
and you were teaching, Glenn, was that in like a mainstream high school teaching system, or?
Yes, I started uh, teaching in Queensland, in Education Queensland, but I was recruited to. I also got my psychology qualifications and my membership to the Australian Psychological Society. And I was very fortunate in that one of the big institutions in Brisbane, which was essentially a teacher education institution, wanted to broaden its professional preparation courses and wanted to not just be solely aligned with the teaching movement. So they were recruiting people who were teacher qualified, but also had uh, psychology qualifications and was registered psychologist. So I got the job fairly easily, even though I was quite young, and that's when I became involved in not just the humanistic education arena, but also trying to develop training for people who were part of the deinstitutionalisation movement for those who were intellectually disabled, who were living in institutions and provided institutional care. And there was an ethos at the time to provide uh, those people with community-based, not just community-based care, but also to become part of organising their own lives and taking responsibility more for their own lives via agencies like the Guardianship Board, etc., and by uh, by institutions which help people to become more self-determining. And that was a heady era because that was the era of not just deinstitutionalisation, but think the concepts like normalisation, social role valorisation was one of the terms that we used at the time, least restrictive alternative living services, etc. And so it was a big movement, and
What year was
Queensland
that, Glenn? Or what?
would have been in the 70s, the early to mid 70s,
Okay.
and Queensland was actually in the forefront of world development in those times. In fact, significant people like Wolf Wolfensberger from Canada, who was the founder of the normalisation sort of concept, travelled to Queensland and interacted with some of the people who were developing a complete change in services in Queensland at the time.
Wow.
It was very a very significant movement, and we felt everyone who was part of that, and there were some very good thinkers at the time, and they were in charge of some of the services, and so had a lot of power to make changes as well. They It was a sense that you were breaking new ground almost on a national and international basis, and
How can I ask too, like, how did you find yourself so involved in that movement? Was that just an outcome from that role that you had?
yes, it
Or
was. Yes, it was just luck, sheer luck, really, in a way, but not just luck in that you had to respond to it in a supportive and um, aligned way. Yeah, because we were trying to develop programs outside of just teacher education, and because this deinstitutionalisation movement was really sweeping the world, really, and well, when I say the world, sweeping America and Australia, it made sense for us to develop programs, professional programs, which would help people who were originally trained in a medical model system and a psychiatric system to move to a community-based group-based care model, which involved the clients in their own, self-determination. So, yeah, it was a coincidence of professional development and historical development, but we took it up with a gusto and really become involved.
wow. And why was that? Why was it, why did you take it up with gusto and sort of what was
Well,
it about that excited you, I guess?
yeah, good question again. A couple of things. One was uh, if you were uh, a party to or observing of what was happening in institutions in those times, you would have been confronted with the absolute horror of when people were just treated as objects rather than as completely involved in their own self-determination. And so that's triggered that there's got to be a better way of providing service for people. And yeah, that's just the horror of that. I think which wasn't we weren't just experiencing ourselves; it was sweeping the United States at the time too, and but also in parallel with that, there was the anti-psychiatry movement that was happening in the psychiatric areas. You know, Thomas Zass and R.D. Laing were writing some of their works and challenging people to provide psychiatric care, which wasn't power oriented care, and that was also present here as well in Queensland. For example, there were a number of institutions that were providing community-based care, like the therapeutic milieu, the power of people supporting each other in a group sense, in a group living sense, and in group work. Uh, so that was in parallel with the deinstitutionalisation movement for those experiencing intellectual disability, and it seemed to all be present, and it was a time of great optimism and enthusiasm. And so um, when we were considering counselling as another area which rather than it just being an adjunct of psychology, that really counselling could take on some of these concepts and provide help for people which wasn't part of the mainstream dominant medical model system. Yeah.
So can I just ask too there, because so you came up through after teaching, you did go on to study psychology and become a registered psychologist. And so why these ideas that that were happening and that you were very much in support of and encouraging, and why didn't they just get absorbed into the existing sort of psychology models? Why did you and others really want to make them separate under this counselling banner?
Yeah, it's good to actually think about this, and thanks for the questions in this regard. But I think the key for me was that I was working with closely working with people from different professional persuasions and philosophies. For example, as I just mentioned, because I was a teacher originally, I was involved in the humanistic education movement. Now, essentially, that involved people who had teaching backgrounds. And then when I became involved with the deinstitutionalisation movement, I was very much involved with social workers, occupational therapists, some of the key occupational therapy people like Jan Dyke, for example, was a significant figure in those days. Then I couldn't maintain a narrow psychological ethos when I was getting pulled into community development considerations from social work, from humanistic group work, values clarification work, from humanistic education. So I was constantly having my own boundaries widened, and it took me away from the very clinical psychology concepts that I'd been schooled with at the University of Queensland, which is where I did my psychology work. So yeah, again, these big movements drew a number of people from different professional and philosophic persuasions together. And
Really out in the community and working with these other people from other professional backgrounds. And what was that like for you then? Sort of having these other ideas introduced, were they sort of already there for you, or was it sort of difficult sort of moving away from the psychological models that
yes,
you
yeah, that's again very interesting to conjecture about that. It was threatening to some extent too, because I felt when I'm interacting with some of the top thinkers in some of these other areas, like social work and occupational therapy, for example, I felt that I couldn't match their thinking, but rather than I suppose there was a choice originally, although you don't think of it at the time, a choice to retreat back into very narrow psychological thinking. I could have done that and then escaped from the hotbed of ideas that were there. Because look, a lot of when I think back on it, a lot of the meetings, a lot of the planning, the course planning, etc., they were pretty hot issues that were being bounced around, and often you felt threatened if you were just maintaining one narrow persuasion. And so, yeah, I gradually, it wasn't just an overnight thing, but I gradually loosened the boundaries and the barriers of that sort of thinking, to the extent where I became a proponent of it and could no longer tolerate just narrow, concentrated, mainstream thinking, psychological or medical model thinking.
So what sort of ideas did you find yourself sort of adopting or using more, or as a result of the work? Like,
Yeah, the ideas of empowerment, of trying to break down barriers of power, of empowering people, of enabling people to be supportive of each other and learners in each other's worlds. I became enamoured very early in the piece with group work, and I believe that good group workers were always working toward people's own self-learnings and empowerment, etc. And this sort of facilitation model, the model of rather than imposing learning, empowering and facilitating learning through other people's experiences. Yeah.
and that's
And the real challenge of that was in the working in the area of people with an intellectual disability, for example, because there have to be then other structures are organised so that those people can become more and more involved in the determination of outcomes in their own lives, to the extent where Queensland, I think, were developing houses in the community which were actually owned by people with people who were experiencing severe and profound, sometimes intellectual disability, who owned the houses through guardianship arrangements, etc., and workers were guests in the people's own houses. So that was a concept that was extreme when you compared that to the total institutionalisation movement that had gone before.
it is. Is that still around today, Glenn, or has that changed again now?
I couldn't really comment on that, Alex, because I've been drawn away, obviously, from working in the disability area to more counselling and family and group counselling.
When you moved into more the counselling area and started to bring some of these ideas from your experiences and work in the disability area across, what sort of were becoming the like the foundation of the counselling approach to counselling and training others in counselling?
Well, originally the counselling course had probably three or four strands to it. One was the classic behavioural, the cognitive behavioural strand. One was the Ericksonian strand with strategic therapies. And that was where we were teaching somewhat the ideas of Milton Erickson or the MRI people in California, etc. So there was that strand. But then there was this also this fairly strong group, humanistic group facilitation strand. And again, I think because we had people who were very passionate about group work, as I was saying before, group work and some of the other ideas coming from the other professions, community development work, etc. That really kept the barriers wide, or kept the boundaries wide for ideas. And then, of course, the major stimulus for all this came along. You wouldn't be surprised to hear Michael White and the Dulwich Family Therapy Centre in Adelaide started to really take off. And a couple.
What were they about, Glenn? What was different and sort of unique about the Dulwich Centre and what Michael White was working on?
Well, I think that again, good question. I think what Michael was on about was, and he was helped by David Epstein, of course, in New Zealand, and David Epstein was open to a lot of the philosophical writings, particularly that were coming from Europe, the writings of Foucault and Derrida, and he was sharing those with Michael, and Michael's great contribution, I think, to epistemology, learning, and counselling in particular, was that he translated those ideas to therapeutic practice, to counselling practice. And like, for example, the concept of the reflecting team, which had originally come about from one of the Norwegian workers, but he really translated it into good practice in counselling and started doing it in the Dulwich Centre in Adelaide. And some of the people that I was working with became interested and then involved in that, people like Roger Lowe. And it accorded with the work we're already doing in group work and in that humanistic group work area. And so we were able to come on board it quickly and see its potential to the extent where it built up a momentum where the course became almost grounded in postmodernist, post-structuralist, constructionist thinking. And to this very day, we've created a community of people who love the concepts and the notions of that.
Share a little bit more around those concepts for people that aren't familiar with post-structuralist therapy, and what was it like that sort of about the work that the Dulwich Centre was doing that really aligned with you, it sounds like it, and what you and Roger Lowe and others were doing at QUT, why it was so easy to sort of hit the ground running with those ideas?
Yeah, it's hard to explain, I suppose, Alex, in that for me it was like a way of thinking that once you moved into that frame of thinking, that you couldn't think any other way then. It was like it was totally immersive. It was totally seductive in that way. For example, I'd done a lot of training over the years with some very significant practitioners in counselling, like Virginia Satir, people like Virginia Satir.
Wow.
But I'd always walk away from those workshops thinking, oh, that's very interesting ideas. I could use it here, I could use it there, maybe that would be relevant here. But when I walked away from the first training with Michael White, I thought that's the only way I can think now is via this philosophy. Everything else. Pardon me, I'm not coming down with coronavirus, I hope, anyway, but usually my early morning throat problems. Yeah, it was totally immersive once you started thinking that way. And the other good thing about it for me, Alex, was that it didn't exclude the other ways of operating or thinking. It just framed them in terms of that there are other interesting ways of operating and thinking.
Can you describe sort of that core philosophy that that just became this new way for you?
Yeah, it's like that. There is no truth out there in terms of what we should do or what we need to do in order to assist people. But there are lots of interesting ways of framing thinking around helping people. Uh, but each one of those ways has some benefits, but also has very strong limitations and very strong ways of framing people that then determine how people think about themselves and how they understand themselves and the world. And so we can move out of those frames and become critical. So it's the development of a complete healthy critical perspective on everything, and but wanting to centre the person that we're working with, helping to centre their ideas and their thoughts and their theories about change for them, rather than impose a model of change which might come from a whole host of other frames of operating and thinking. So yeah, it's this being with people and understanding how they frame their world, but also helping them to also position themselves so that they see that their frames have also been developed from how the influences that have happened to them, and that they can stand outside of their frames and then choose to take stands
Yeah.
about what's what might be helpful or not helpful to them in their hopes and dreams for themselves in the future. So what I love about the constructionist approach is that I think David Epstein and Michael have said this themselves, that therapy or counselling is really a political activity rather than a therapeutic one. So you're asking people to invite them to understand that their thinking and how they construe the world has in fact been developed and constructed in particular ways, and they can take a stand and determine how they use or don't use those frames, and to yeah uh,
So
be
it's
aware of themselves.
like assuming people have their own ideas about change and how to make changes they want for their life, but and then the worker's role as a facilitator in providing a process to sort of work together to find out what those are and make them more known.
Yeah, that's well said.
And but it's like it would have been such like an exciting time, I imagine, seeing these ideas and new ways of working take off and a move from and this more community way of working um, start to happen more and more. So, like, what I'm interested in, like, what these ideas and this way of working, the impacts it's sort of had for you. In your work with people in a work context, but also like in your personal life, and what was there things changing for you there as well, you know, as you continue to sort of work in these newer ideas.
Yeah, I'm laughing because uh, yeah, the ideas have probably maybe saved me from some of the destructive possibilities that might have come around my own life too, and my personal life, in that if I perceive that there's a great power in perceiving that the way things are understood and framed are just frames, are just ways of understanding, and that I can be empowered myself to uh, consider those ideas, think about those ideas, but also understand where they've come from, particularly in the medical model, I suppose, because the medical model is so strong in our thinking that, and that's not to say that the great things about the medical model is the advances that have happened in medical science, for example, have probably kept us on the planet. And but the way we relate to and understand medicine is something all of us really could really do with, rather than just be a total adherent, a believer in what is said about us, and particularly in the psychiatric medical arena too. One of the things that therapy as a political activity speaks to me about is that if I work with people in a professional way, and if I work with people in a personal way too, outside of the professional arena, that I should not unconsciously or inadvertently reinforce the already disempowering power structures that people are often victim of, and that I should not be an unwitting or unconscious adherent to those, that I should stand outside of those and help people that I'm dealing with stand outside of those themselves. And if that's a member of my family, or if that's a person on the street, or if that's a client in a therapy situation, doesn't matter. I think it's exactly the same.
And by doing that, what have you sort of seen? Like you've kept working in this way now for many, many years and continue to teach these practices of working with people. So what is it that that's by sort of holding on to that idea of politics in counselling and really helping people to question strong ideas or things that are happening in their life? What have you seen become possible for people that it keeps, that it's kept you working this way?
For me, I think that when you work with people and you see them start to think in those terms, and it's not always the case. Some people, it's difficult often to drag yourself out of drag yourself up by your intellectual shoestrings, so to speak, or that some people find it extremely difficult because they're swamped by the pain or by the ideas that are flowing around them. But when clients are able to do that, it's an elation feeling for everyone. I think I've been in rooms where we've been working either with individuals or with groups, and you can feel the person start to take on their own personal power. They get a sense of what it's like to be empowered for the first time in life. That doesn't mean to say the pain's going to go away of the circumstances they're in,
Yeah.
but they understand that they're the kernel of thinking and understanding, and they're no longer trying to force themselves into following edicts from others and becoming self. The great thing about reading the philosophers like Foucault, etc., is that, and Michael White in terms of the actual day-to-day therapy, is that power is internalized. We unfortunately accept edicts that we then marginalise ourselves through our own thinking. We then believe we're not the same as other people, and we pathologise ourselves and marginalise ourselves in terms of I'm not a good, reasonable human being because I don't behave, I don't think, I don't fit with other structures. When people can move outside of that, it's a sense of elation, really, in a way. It's, yeah.
And I liked how you said there that it doesn't mean it's going to take pain away for people of whatever experience is happening for them or has happened. But so in thinking about people going to counselling or for some sort of therapeutic help, yeah, this and that reference around taking people's pain away, like, can you just say a little bit more about how, like in the post-structuralist models, that's sort of not necessarily the hope isn't to take people's pain away or to fix what's happening, but yeah, how else might you sort of describe, you know, some of the goals, I guess, or hopes for people in working with this way, because it's different to that idea of helping people fix what's happening in their life or get rid of pain.
Yeah, well, it would be nice to take. I'm not a masochist or a sadist, so it would be nice to have pain alleviated for all of us. But I think the reality is that I don't know who said it, but life is suffering, and so the choice that we have is not to avoid suffering, but it's to make sense of suffering and to position ourselves in ways that where we understand that suffering, its effects, how that suffering involves us and other people, etc., and to take a meaning stance about that, how it is we understand it, manage it on a day-to-day basis, etc., and to just constantly challenge all of the assumptions that we tend to automatically make that may be hurting us. And so I think that I suppose in a funny sort of way, the analogy might be to take away some of the mental knives we use to stab ourselves with, and therefore that alleviates some of the self-imposed ideological pain that we're doing ourselves. Yeah. And that goes to the very fibre of what we're doing too. I think even the concept of counselling, you know, is to people come along to that activity as a client with all sorts of notions that they've internalised from some of the dominant ideas about counselling, and that we need to be aware of that, I think, and to challenge those ideas with them ourselves and challenge our own selves about what it is that we're doing in a counselling, inverted commas, context. And I think that's where my life, when I reflect back on it, I don't reflect back too often, but when I reflect back on it in situations like this, I've been exceptionally fortunate in seeing the different ways in which people have tried to struggle to try and move outside of the ways of thinking that have produced pain for people, like as I said before, pain for people experiencing intellectual disability. You know, there have been horror circumstances where we've all for the right inverted commas reasons, we've imposed such negative, controlling circumstances, dehumanising circumstances on people that when you see that, you really then are very much alert to how might we still be doing that today in a less dramatic sense, but nevertheless in a potent sense as well. Yeah.
To continue sort of questioning our own practices all the time. And
let me say right at the outset, I mean, as soon as I do that, I move into self-criticism and self-evaluation, things saying, I'm not doing that enough, and when is it that I've really challenged what I'm doing, etc. But again, I don't want to, according to the philosophy, I really need to stop myself from moving into those self-critical frames as well of that, just so long as I can gently continue to embrace those notions. Yeah.
Mm. And I guess you've been quite a significant teaching figure in this area of counselling for a lot of years now, and taught myself and lots of colleagues of mine, and regarded, by a really significant, as a really significant influence for me and a lot of others I know working from this post-structuralist framework. But who would you say has been your most significant influence in this work? And what is
These are challenging questions, aren't they? Yeah. Well, yeah. A couple of things spring to mind. One is, and if I'm not careful here, I'll tear up a bit here too. That there was a person I worked with in the 70s, in the early 70s and mid 70s, who was passionate about humanistic education, group work, group facilitation, values clarification, work with people. And that's Ron 80. He died a few years ago, and he introduced me to the power of group work. I used to, he used to invite me to facilitate different groups, and I always remember driving to these groups in the morning and then I'd look at my knuckles on the steering wheel of the car and they'd be white with tension and pressure, and I thought, because I would see myself more as introverted in my orientation to the world, and I thought, why am I doing this to myself? Why am I putting myself into such extreme tension and pressure? And I'd go into that group with such anxiety, it would be incredible. But then after a couple of hours of working with a particular group, I'd then drive home again at the end of that day, for example, after doing a sensitivity group or a group that was a self-development group. And I'd feel like singing in the car, I'd be uplifted. And so the power of being with people as they share learnings, share their own journeys, support each other, etc. And that was just so powerful. And I would be a very different person if it hadn't have been for Ron 80 to start with. Obviously, I'm going to say Michael White gave the intellectual basis for working in the way that I did, and again, I'd tear up again thinking about my work with Michael, and he was just so significant to think that I'm not the Ron 80, myself, and a few others are not just the only ones. There's a worldwide belief and passion in these ideas that Michael promulgated. And then probably closer to home, the colleagues that I've had over the years have, Michael's concept of a community of concern. It's so powerful that people need to support each other in their ideas and their thoughts. The course, my involvement in the course at QUT was self-generated, if you like, by people like Roger Lowe, who's still involved in a very part-time sense, very powerful thinker. And I could name a lot of, well, I won't go through all the different names of my colleagues, but every one of the most of my colleagues, almost every one of my colleagues, have been part of the generation of these ideas, which without that community would have floundered. And it's interesting that the struggles that I've had have not been within that group, but have been in the mainstream groups. Like the big struggle I had was to establish the clinic, the Reflecting Team Clinic at Castledine campus, as it was.
Can you explain a little bit about reflecting teams and how, I guess it was such a significant, contribution to learning, and it's so unique still to this day in terms of who works in this way with a reflecting team?
Yeah, well, I think it comes about because it provides a medium for uh, more than one person to be involved in another one's life. And like we use very artificially constructed teams in a way, that because we've integrated in with the course so that the students can then become teams to a reflecting team to a client who's coming for counselling work. But it doesn't have to be this artificially constructed way either. It can be a group of clients who we can draw together in a group sense, and they can become a reflecting team to each other's journey. Or as Michael developed the concept of the outsider witness, we can bring another person in who may have experienced something which touches the difficulties that the client is touching, and then talk with the counsellor in front of the client in a reflecting way, which positions the client in an observer reflective space where they're not having to actively challenge or actively consider their own thoughts, but just bathe themselves in the reflections of others. I don't see any dramatic novelty or difference in reflecting team work when you compare it to the 1970s, maybe earlier too. That's my only experience. I can only go back to the 1970s, but the group work, we were doing things like group on group, goldfish bowls, if you like, and what we were doing was not terribly different from the reflecting team process. But what's happened, I think, is that we've used the team in an ongoing constructed way and made it available to all of our clients if they wish to, rather than you have to join a specific group in order to get the power of other people's reflections about you. And we've refined the language of it too, and we've grounded and this is the contribution that I think we've made. When I say we, people like Roger Lowe and myself and a lot of my colleagues, that we've made to refining a way of talking, a way of conversing that isn't a way that invites self-evaluation, self-criticism, which actually encourages people to believe in themselves, their own thinking, their own frames of reference.
And what would you describe sort of the value of having a reflecting team, or that sort of type of group work brings for clients?
Well, okay, just speak on in terms of what clients say, Alex, and that is that there's a bit of a journey that client, as you know very well yourself, having done this, that there's a journey that most clients take, and that is they initially come to a counselling process with usually the mainstream dominant ways of seeing counselling is they're going to be advised about what's useful or not useful to them from an outside perspective. And so they're very fearful of having more than one person
Yeah.
talking about them. And so it's almost like they offer themselves in a leap of faith. But once they experience it, even just one time of experiencing it, like as you would know, we probably have this little ethos that if they experience the reflecting team and it is not helpful to them, then they don't have to proceed. They can retreat back to just working with a counsellor. And it's my experience over many, like as I say, from 1989 probably to today. It's my experience that we've had clients who come to the clinic, and if they're told that you can't have a reflecting team today because there are too many absences, there's a lot of sickness, they say, well, we'll have to make another appointment because we don't wish to proceed today. You know, that without the team, that's the core, the kernel of what's helpful to them. They come for the team, essentially, I think, more than anything.
Yeah. And this was sort of it was you that introduced reflecting teamwork to QUT.
Roger Lowe was also very instrumental too. Yeah. Mm.
Yeah, and so you were saying earlier about the influence that people like Ron Adey and Michael White have had on your life, both professionally and personally. And what I guess, what do you think they would say about the impact that you've had on this way of working people or this movement?
Yeah, it's difficult to say too. Like Ron, I think Ron never fully understood. I think the power of constructionist thinking. He understood the power of group work and people's supportiveness of each other and sharing of their own perspectives in a group context. So
Yeah.
Ron would probably say that it's great that I and people like my colleagues have kept that group ethos going. He was enamored with the group, the community,
Yeah.
and but I think he would lose some of the power of constructionism.
Yeah.
That we've grounded all of
Yeah.
that conversation in. Michael, I think he'd just smile and just laugh about the fact that we've come aboard. As I say, the good ship constructionism has a lot of people on board and they have a great time. But a bit like the Ruby Princess and coronavirus, once you get on board the ship, you can't get off it. You have to sail on it for the rest of your life. Yeah.
Yeah. It sort
You
of
can
becomes a
go
way
to
of
you can go to lots of different ports, and you can have other interactions with other ships and go to different oceans, etc. But you're still aboard the good ship constructionism.
yeah, sort of becomes a way of being, and just seeing the world, really. Yeah.
Exactly.
How it has been for me. Yeah.
That's well said, Alex. That years ago, I'd switch into things like, oh, should I do some relaxation training with this person? Should I do some cognitive behavior challenging with this person? Should I do some Virginia Satir structural work with this family, etc., uh, or not? But you don't ask that question of post-structuralist thinking. You cannot say, I can't think in a way that's not post-structuralist. Once you're on board, you're there.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I would agree with that, definitely. And Glenn, seeing as you've brought up coronavirus and what's happening at the moment in the world, I'm interested to sort of get your take in how you're seeing it. I think when we were getting ready to do this interview, you made a mention as like that you're seeing it as a bit of a circuit breaker, and an opportunity to pause and reconsider. So I wondered, what has it had you pausing about or
Yeah,
reconsider?
great, great question again, Alex. You must be schooled in postmodernist thinking, I think.
By the
Uh,
bed.
uh, yeah, I actually think that one of the gifts that it's giving us is that all of the typically accepted patterns of operating and running our lives and how we operate our work situations, etc., uh, are, are challenged, and that's what post post-structural thinking is all about. Is trying to stand outside of our systems and be critical of them, and challenge them and think about why we do them. Well, the coronavirus, I think, has done this for us. It means that we can no longer, in probably in most, almost in most aspects of our life, our daily life, can't automatically just be drawn into the automatic.
Mm,
And that means that we have to make some decisions about how we do things, whether we do them and why we do them and how we do them, etc. Not to everything in total, but to a lot of significant aspects of our life. Yeah. So for that reason, it's pretty good. Uh, what's I'm looking for a word that it's a circuit. Yeah, as you said, it's a bit of a circuit breaker, and I don't want to make light of the fact that it's a horrific circumstance either. That people's lives have been torn apart by it, and people have died. Many tens of thousands of people have died, and all of the trauma that brings to their loved ones and families, etc. But I'm just curious about the day-to-day routines that we don't normally challenge or take, and we just take them for granted. Mm.
yeah, absolutely. I've definitely found myself thinking so much more often than before all this, oh, do I really need to do that, or should we be looking at doing it differently, and really giving, starting to think about what, as a family and in my work, like what do I want to keep after this, from this experience.
Right.
But around that, when it is such a significant time, for people, and sort of predicting, and in both in the mental health world as well, that it will sort of create a bit of an influx, perhaps, of work for us as human service workers. And I wanted to ask you about, like, what your hopes might be around our mental health system in Australia, for what it might be getting them to sort of reconsider in how we support people with mental health and, you know, help facilitate change. What you sort of think about what's currently happening and what you hope can happen more.
Well, one of the things I see happening, which plays into that, and just recently Anzac Day, you know, where people are observing their own thoughts about Anzac Day and expressing that in a more community-oriented sense, just on a local basis, street by street almost, and that gives a degree of optimism, I think, about if we can only move from some of the large, big central structures we have of providing help for people, service for people, to a much more smaller community-based and provide platforms or ways, mechanisms for how people can come together. There's already signs, you know, lots of signs of that happening already in the community. You know, men's sheds and you know, a lot of the smaller. But I've also had over the last couple of years experience in people working in alternative education settings. You know, the flexi school sort of settings where a lot of young people who can't survive well in the mainstream education system can be given an alternative education setting. And those settings usually involve developing a community sense, a bit like the old group sort of sense I was talking about in the 70s, that the power of being together in small communities cannot be overcome by just providing central authority-based structures of go to a hospital and you'll be fixed sort of thing. So I just hope that some of the ways that we've had to move back to our own local communities, we don't lose that when the challenge of a big health crisis like coronavirus leaves eventually, if it does leave. And that was Michael White's gift too. Of course, he was working much more on a community sense rather than providing. I think he needed to provide the one-to-one, one-to-family therapeutic approaches he was taking initially, but you could see that he was moving much more to a community-oriented focus in his later practice. Yeah. Which SKATTLE is doing as well. It's very much a community. So long live, community ventures all over that will spring up all over the place.
Absolutely. That's certainly what we hope and work towards at SKATTLE and do. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Glen. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. I mean, it's made me think. As I say, I never think of the themes of my life, which is not just themes of my life, but themes in the overall progression of services for the community, and how 3 or 4 huge strands of development since the 1970s have been so powerful for me to be part of those, and to generate those into my own practice and the practice of my colleagues has been, a real, well, I wouldn't have it any other way. If I had to live my life over again, I would still be prescribing my involvement in those large, lovely movements that move to the point of being where people are at rather than imposing on people.
Yeah. Oh, thank you, Glenn. What a nice way to finish.
Okay, Alex, good. Thank you.